All right, everybody, welcome to week two, day two. Today we're going to be talking about the supply function, things that shift the supply curve, and briefly be analyzing, thinking about ways the supply can be used to analyze unemployment benefits and aspects of the labor market. Uh, okay, so reading this day is pages 16 through 20 in the book for the second edition. And so, studying business decision making is an important use for supply. So, we can answer questions like what does it cost a business to produce output? And there's really flexible interpretations of supply, can offer insight into many areas of business, economics, and seemingly unrelated areas like supply in a dating market. We can also study labor supply decisions. So, we can answer questions like why do people work? And analyze like wages with that. So we'll jump right into it. These are the job losses associated with the coronavirus pandemic. I couldn't find the updated one, but as you can see, unemployment remains much higher for longer after recession than with typical recessions in the United States. I think this is just kind of interesting to frame the conversation around supply. And I've collected a large amount of economic research on the coronavirus pandemic and unemployment for you on this slide. And I'm not going to go through it in depth, but feel free to read at your own leisure on some of these things. And they're particularly related mostly to unemployment benefits in this context and some on stimulus payments. So let's talk about the supply curve a little bit more. I briefly introduced this in week two, day one. This is just a supply curve with price on the y-axis and quantity on the x-axis over here. But it's pretty easy to, adapt this to thinking about why individuals work. And so all we did was change price to, wage per hour. And, voila, this is a basic model of labor supply. So what prediction does it make? It predicts that as wages increase, the quantity of hours you supply to the labor market increases, which, if someone pays you more, you might be willing to work more. So this is just kind of the maintained kind of uh, way that will proceed in these slides. So another thing to note is supply is just the marginal cost curve. And so this comes right out of page 201 in the OpenStax Principles of Microbook, which you can review if you're less familiar with this. But supply is just this marginal cost curve, particularly above this break-even point. And then there's these other ways to define costs, which determine whether or not a business will operate. And the break-even point is if you get to this point or above it, then you're making profits. And the shutdown point is if the price is below the shutdown point, then you're going to shut down. And we can just adapt this to the labor market and thinking about your own labor supply. And so basically the point above the minimum average cost curve is the firm supply curve. So above the shutdown point, marginal cost is supply. And so let's start to think more mathematically about this. Here's a labor supply curve, and uh, we're going to assume that there's no fixed costs so that the break even point is equal to the shutdown point. And this is just going to simplify our discussion of the labor supply curve. And so a basic equation is, quantity supplied equals some constant where you work 0 hours for some wage or below it, plus beta times a wage, where beta is the slope, and beta is influencing the elasticity of supply, with higher betas indicating a more inelastic supply curve, meaning you're less price sensitive. And I'm going to get into that later and discuss that a little bit more. So let's add numbers to our example to reduce some of the abstraction. So alpha right here is our shutdown point. So any price or wage lower than 5, we're not going to provide any labor to the market. And so at alpha, or at 5 in this case, wages are not high enough to cover the cost of what you're giving up to work, in which case, we're going to assume it's leisure or some other activity. And so at $5 an hour, like, it's not a large enough wage to even convince you to get out of bed. So the amount of labor you supply at wage 5 or less equals 0. So there are some other determinants of supply that are modeled along this curve as well. And so as these change, they'll be represented as some change or shift to the supply curve. And those four things that we think about in this kind of canonical supply and demand model is prices of inputs, technology, expectations, and number of sellers. So I'm going to talk about each of those briefly. So prices of inputs. If the inputs to your business become more expensive, then you're going to the supply curve shifts inwards. So if an important input in you supplying your own labor is the price of gas, well, if gas goes from 250 to $5, it's more expensive for you to drive to work, and you'll reduce the amount of hours that you work. As inputs become less expensive, then you reverse that. And kind of the most well-known or widely used input for processes is energy. So oil or energy is kind of thought of as a very typically used input. So another important determinant of supply is technology. So better technology will increase the supply curve or shift it outwards, because this represents a more efficient production. So I know a lot of people think about computers when you think about technology, but in this course, a computer is not technology, a computer is capital. So all technology does is it's a different way of combining your available inputs. So while a computer is not technology, it's capital, the operating software that it uses, such as Windows 95, which would be a kind of an outdated technology, whereas Windows 10 is a more up-to-date technology. A Windows 95 to Windows 10 is an increase in your technology, and it will shift your supply curve outwards for homework. And so, like I said, notice it's very important to make the distinction that these are not computers, these are operating systems that computers use to combine the inputs. So a computer's capital is, its monitor, its keyboard, its RAM, its processors, etc. And these operating systems combine those inputs to produce an output. Expectations, again, I'm not going to talk about it too much, but if suppliers expect prices to rise in the future, they'll sell less now. This is a picture from the oil price caving in. And so suppliers were just leaving barrels of oil at sea, waiting until the price increased to bring them onto land. And then the number of sellers will also affect the supply in the market. So if more sellers enter the market, then supply will shift out. And so this is Chipotle downtown. It entered the market that increased the number of sellers in the downtown food market. And then if sellers leave the market, supply shifts inward. So this is where uh, Clutch was, and they also went out of business. I guess this building is just cursed. Sucks, man. So Dairy Queen was there before Clutch, and they both exited the market, causing the supply curve and the downtown food to shift inwards. So we need to talk, more specifically about how we interpret a supply curve. So just like quantity demanded refers to a specific point on the curve, quantity supplied would also refer to a specific point on the curve, whereas supply is the entire curve. So I'm going to show you a point on the supply curve. Um, and so at price equals 7, quantity supplied equals 10. And so that's an important distinction to make, that supply is not 10, the quantity supplied is 10 when the price is 7. And then something else we need to talk about is elasticity, which I'll get more into depth, but this is a measure of how much the percent quantity supplied changes with a percent change in price. And so with our kind of canonical, whatever equation here, quantity supplied equals alpha plus beta times wage. as beta increases, elasticity decreases, and as beta decreases, elasticity increases. So, but importantly, beta is not the elasticity, it's just the slope of the supply curve. And this elasticity is also used with demand curves. Again, I'll talk about it more later, but it's important that we note here that, like, so for this example, the supply curve's equation is 5 plus 2 times 0.2 times wages. And so we can interpret that a dollar increase in wages leads to a 0.2 increase in quantity of hours supplied. So 20% of an hour, um, so like 12 minutes or something like that. Um, if you get a $1 higher wage, you'll increase the hours, the quantity supplied by uh, about 12 and a half minutes. Is what this curve is saying. But I'm going to show you curves with different values for beta. Here's one. This light blue curve is more inelastic, so it's a steeper curve. It's relatively steeper, and you'll notice that the beta is larger, so it's less elastic or more inelastic. And then alternatively, we could have a more elastic curve, which is got a lower beta, and you can see that it's relatively flatter. So that's how you should start to think about elasticity. And then one thing I want to talk about a little bit as an application of this is you're thinking about unemployment from the perspective of a policymaker. What should you set unemployment benefits to be? You want it to be high enough to help people get through the crisis, but uh, the drawbacks of higher unemployment benefits is there's a work disincentive in that if you expect to earn more, that is, they set unemployment benefits higher for being unemployed, then you're less incentivized to go to work. And this is kind of close to my heart because I couldn't have an unemployed friend help me with a tent one year, a fireworks tent, because he was receiving unemployment benefits. So I'm a little, I guess, biased from that perspective. But um, there's a lot of research on unemployment and unemployment duration, and I'm actually going to make this a discussion board for us to talk about some of the research that has actually been published on this and the trade-offs involved. Um, and then another thing to think about with unemployment benefits is, especially at the federal level, we know that regional labor markets vary a lot. So New York City and Preston County, West Virginia, they have much different labor markets with much different wages. And so that's an important kind of thing to think about when you're setting unemployment benefits, especially if you're doing it at the federal level. It might have an uneven effect on different markets in different places. So let's think about like Preston County labor market. Let's say that, let's assume that's perfectly competitive and that the price is equal to 9. Well, then the quantity in, say thousands of hours is 5,000 hours. Whereas if we're in New York City, uh, the supply and demand is just different there. And let's say that the price is 19 in equilibrium and the quantity is, 5 million hours or something like that. Well, if you come in here and set an unemployment benefit of, let's say, $15 an hour, well, that has very different implications for people in Preston County compared to New York City. At New York City, it wouldn't make much different compared to a job, whereas in Preston County, um, if on average, you earn $9 in a job, but you can make 15 from being unemployed, well, you know, it affects your labor, your working decisions differently. And unemployment benefits not exactly the minimum wage, so I'm not drawing in those things that you've probably seen in 201 yet, but we are going to have a discussion about these things I think is really interesting. So in conclusion, the supply function, it's asking how much producers are willing to produce at each price. uh, And so one, kind of example is that as an individual, you supply labor in the labor market so that businesses can produce output, and they demand a certain number of hours to produce their products. Um, Businesses, they're thinking about like how much money they can get for producing um, Coca-Cola or iPhones or PS5s or whatever. And we know that there are several determinants of supply that will shift the supply curve and affect the equilibrium in markets. That's kind of a 201 thing, but I will ask you to do some of that basic analysis in your homework. And then unemployment benefits are something that is used to address unemployment, and as a federal policy, it could have unequal effects on different regions, um, depending on how it's done. So that's everything for this set of slides. Thanks for sticking with me, and I'll see you again next week.